The truth of it is we define diversity as honoring differences. I think we're very good at honoring differences. We're not very good at practicing it. We're much better at celebration. We know more about holidays than we do about people themselves. So that personal experience is still lacking in the year 2021.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Mun Wah is an internationally renowned documentary filmmaker, TED speaker, author, poet, folkteller, educator, community therapist, and master diversity trainer at Stir Fry Seminars and Consulting, a diversity training company he founded. He's most famous for his truly incredible documentaries like The Color of Fear, Last Chance for Eden, and If These Halls Could Talk. His films feature hard-hitting, honest, and raw conversations about race relations, racism, sexism, systemic inequality, and more, with participants from different backgrounds and ethnicities. In this conversation, we talk about growing up as a Chinese American kid just trying to fit in, his love for teaching and how he became a teacher, the day that changed his life, his mother's murder by an African American man, which started his journey into ultimately becoming a therapist and diving into the topics of race, inequality, and hatred. We also talk about his documentary, The Color of Fear, the implicit racism of who we see and how we see the people in front of us, the names we're willing and the names that we're unwilling to learn, the minority groups society doesn't bother to get to know and to make feel welcome, the critical importance of empathy and listening, what he's learned about facilitating workshops discussing tough topics in a mindful way, on standing up for others who are different from oneself, his autobiography In the Making, River of Jade, and many other topics. I was really touched by this conversation with Mun Wah. He brings such ease and openness to the conversation, even when the topics are quite challenging. He helps us see our society from points of view other than our own and teaches us the skills to reach out and connect across differences, which is the first step towards correcting some of the structural injustice embedded in our systems. This conversation is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs who are working to change our world for the better. So please follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now, let's jump right in with Mun Wah. All right, I'm sitting here with Mun Wah. Mun Wah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So usually these days we start with a COVID check-in. So I'd love to hear where it caught you in the world. You know, what was your personal experience? How did it affect your personal life? And then how did it affect your work?
Well, actually, it's interesting because I was really getting tired of flying. I do a lot of flying. In fact, at one point, I realized that when I went to Alaska that I had gone to every single state in the United States. And the luggage was getting heavier, putting it up into the compartment, and then the travel was exhausting. Sometimes I'd fly 1 hour to Kentucky to do a keynote and then fly right back. And so it was getting really tiresome. And then so when the virus hit, though I was very concerned, obviously, like everyone else, and then also I was wondering how it would affect, because everything I'd done prior to that was all in person. What I discovered was that the workshops were just as profound and moving online as they were in person, no matter what the number was. And I think that what I came to understand and realize was that it wasn't just because I was there personally. It was their connection with each other. It was the way I was setting it up, giving them questions, teaching them how to be empathetic and curious. And it was their connections and then their shock that they could get that close to each other. In fact, the common response I kept getting after my workshops was, I've shared with this person things I've never told anybody. or I'm surprised at how emotional I got, and it's online. And so it was shocking to me that I could still be able to do the same type of work online that I did in person. And then I eventually told folks, I said, the truth of it really is, even in person, we don't necessarily get that close. And so here, what it is that you're able to see everybody. When I have an audience of 1,000 people and I have somebody stand up and say something, the people in the back can't see them and only the people in front of them. So in other words, they basically have to come up to the front to talk. And if they come up to the front facing everybody, it changes the way they talk. It changes the way they relate. And so what happens is with online, you're all facing each other. And so it was something that people were still able to see that. And so I loved it. But I also think that the virus created an environment where people started to, in many ways, hold the personal relationships for the very first time, didn't take them as for granted, that they missed that.
Yeah.
And so I think that longing, when they finally came onto the online where they could finally talk to each other again, was very moving for them. In other words, they felt it was very precious time. Whereas I think sometimes we take it for granted, as simple as talking to each other, as simple as walking each other through the room and saying hello to each other. And so I think that became much more important. I also think that perhaps what the virus also created was a sense of temporariness of us, our mortality, that people we knew were dying, were getting sick. And that really, for the very first time, we were facing not an epidemic just for the United States or just for California, but for the whole world. And that our very being was being threatened. And sadly, I think that maybe we didn't look at climate change or we didn't look at our frailty until the crises. There is a saying in therapy, which is, it is at the precipice we change, which I think is sad because we oftentimes avoid looking at our reactions, the consequences of our actions until it's too late. And I think it was something like Mark Twain once said, is that Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I'm just hoping that we'll learn a lesson from it. I know that here in Berkeley, for instance, the freeways were totally empty and the air was clear and you could hear yourself. I think that in many ways, we try to get back to the way it was before, but forgotten the consequences once again. And I don't know what it's going to take for that to happen, but I wish we could have learned even more so the lessons from this virus.
Yeah. In our company, we also run workshops, though very different kinds of workshops. They're design workshops. But I was skeptical, the same as you before. I thought presence was everything. We used to fly around the world. And now I see it as just one more form of being. It works so well online. Some things make a difference. So for instance, until I bought a larger monitor, I did feel a little bit disconnected from these workshops. And then I got a much larger monitor and then suddenly I feel like I'm there. So it's these little tricks.
Exactly. In fact, I had to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And because in my work, I have to see as many people as possible. And then because I could only see a limited number, I had to have co-facilitators looking at the other monitors to see who raised their hands and things like this, or who had a reaction. Yeah. But even then, when I think about it, even when I had 100 people, I couldn't see all the reactions either because they were hiding behind people or in seats and everything. And so in so many ways, online allows you to see everybody's face, but you only get a limited of so many people on a screen that you could possibly look at. Because many times people have 400 or 500 people they want me to work with at a time. And other times it's 1,000 or so. But by then I can't do breakout rooms, but I can't cover 1,000 screens. But it does give me that face-on opportunity to look at people's reactions more so than if I were in the room with them.
So we have this opener question that we like to ask to start exploring the life of the guest. And this is a standard question, which is, what's something you've learned in childhood or early in life that is still with you today, that still drives you today?
Well, I think that my life is very unique in many ways. My life story is coming out this year called River of Jade. And I call it my life before my mother was murdered and my life after my mother was murdered. And I think that those are two very distinct differences. A little bit like before 9/11 and after 9/11, or before virus and after virus. I was a teacher. I was born in the flatlands of Oakland, and I went to all the Oakland schools, and I was student body president and things like this. Some of the most profound things, I could pick out 3 or 4 that really changed my life. I was not very good at school. I found it very repetitive, and I couldn't understand why we took tests, to be honest with you.
Mm.
And it was all about testing how well you remembered something. And it took away from me all the love that I had for writing, for studying science or biology or anything like this. And so I started to really question that and resisted it. And later on, I called it academic bulimia. In other words, you just throw up all the stuff that you're supposed to learn for that moment, and then you just forget it. And I think oftentimes, I mean, my worst experience was having in college, a professor simply read out of his book rather than talk about it. And today, when I ask most educators, for high school, elementary, junior high, it's all about passing the test versus exciting people about the topic. And I think that where it became more real for me was when I got to tutor a group of 3 kids who had never gone to public school. And they were literally writing reports. They were just following, drawing, in other words, they were so excited all the way up to almost high school. And I never met another student that was like that. And then later on, when I became a teacher, I thought I wanted to make it come alive. I wanted to have it be relevant. And so I remember my very first day of teaching special ed kids is what I specialized in. And maybe because I related to that, was that I said, it's not that you can't learn. It's just that we haven't figured out a way to teach you. And I think it's very true. And I think perhaps when I look at that very simple phrase that I gave to my students, I started to realize that it's not that we as people of color don't fit into this country or feel comfortable or any minority. It's because this culture has never taken the time to get to know us and to make us feel like we belong. And I think that all of my life, since the day I was born in this country, has been about blending in to how to be a successful white heterosexual male middle class. And that even this shirt, which you may not be able to see very well, is Tibetan, is that I could never wear that to corporate America. And when I wrote my resume out, it was not about how I felt and moved in the world as a Chinese American young man born in the flatlands of Oakland poor. I know exactly how I should have written my resume and exactly how my graduate advisor would have recommended that I write it. And also what I should have dressed, look like and sound like when I go in for that interview. And I remember very well when I was going for my first teaching interview. And it was very interesting because I'd gone to 3 or 4, and then I was waiting for this one. And then I was sitting there, and I guess he didn't know that I was sitting there. And he turned to the guy and he said, he just interviewed the principal. And he said, "You got the job. I just got to get done with this last guy." And so I went in the room and I heard what he said. And I remember taking off my tie, taking off my suit jacket. And I just said to him, "I'm tired. I'm really damn good with kids. I think I would make a wonderful teacher here. I think I could add a whole lot to what you're doing." And I said, "I didn't learn a damn thing when I was in school, and I had to pretty much pick it up on my own." And then he looked at me and I thought, "Oh, for sure, I'm just going to get kicked out of this room." And he looked at me and he goes, "That's the same way I felt about school." And he goes, "Yes, you're hired."
Wow.
And I say that to you with a great deal of also humbleness, because it could have gone the other way.
Sure.
He could have said, "Okay, you're out." But I was very fortunate, and telling the truth is very rare in this society and being well received. And especially if you're a man of color or a person of color or a woman sometimes, a lot of times, or gay or poor. And it meant a lot to me. And that's how I taught. And I really opened up my classroom. And for instance, when we were doing compositions, I said to the kids, "I want you to write down 10 topics you'd love to write about. And you won't be graded on grammar." And the kids just wrote like mad. In other words, I wanted to revive their love of writing, just like I did myself. And I created puppetry and drama so they could learn, for many Black children, to be more verbal rather than simply writing things, reading things. But they wanted to physically move and express themselves. I thought it was a modality that we did not allow Latino and Black kids to really fully express themselves and feel like that was important to use. I think it really is. I think to be able to be sociable, to be articulate, to be able to share how you feel and through music and art is really, to me, a gift to have. not just your knowledge. I don't know how many times I work with folks and they could regurgitate a lot of knowledge, but they can't tell you what they think about what they just shared or how it felt. Or I was just talking to another therapist who I was telling them about a traumatic racist experience. And this is what she said to me. She said, what has occurred to you, Mr. Lee, is that your window of tolerance just got stimulated. And I looked at her and I said, you have achieved an ability within 30 seconds to absolutely disconnect me with anything of getting to know you. In fact, I feel like I don't want to share with you anymore what I'm talking about. And maybe the truth of it really is you're trying to relate to what I just shared from your world, to define it and fix it so you can understand me through your own little window. And I said, that's not how people of color talk to each other. And we do it from the heart, not from the head. And we want to get to know. We ask questions. We reflect back. We tell people, I was very touched by what you shared. That's why today when we started our interview, and I said to you, I wanted you to share how you felt about what I said. It was really important to me. And I think some of the worst interviews I had, there's no relationship to the questions that they've asked me. And so I think that was the phenomenal difference. I think my mother talked to me like that, whereas my father was very business oriented and factual. And so when I used to watch my parents when they had dinners, I would watch my mother not just go see lots of people. How are you doing? Da, da, da. My mom would sit down and talk with them. And then my father it'd be the quantity. And he'd use the same kind of, how you doing? The same kind of joke. But he was stiff and you could feel that. And one of the things that I shared that when my mother died, there's a custom in the Chinese culture, and that is that you bow. And what I shared was that when people bowed at my mom's funeral, they cried and they bowed because they loved her. When at my father's funeral, they bowed out of respect, but not because they loved him. And I could see the way they bowed. And I think that perhaps that's still what's missing in our culture today. I was thinking when Lewis and Clark met the first people, one of the things three things they asked of them. First of all, when they met Lewis and Clark, they were speaking Spanish. And through the interpreter, Lewis and Clark said, why are you speaking Spanish? And what they said was to welcome the new people coming. What a phenomenal idea, wasn't it? To welcome the new people coming. What we do today is when people come from another country, we demand that they blend in, that they speak English only.
Right.
We have no desire to learn their languages or to learn about them. And then when the American Indians, the first people, asked of the settlers was simply this: we ask of you for three things: take care of the land, take care of each other, and share what you have. We didn't do any of those. That's why I think we are where we are today. In other words, there's so much that we could learn from the people of the world. What I think the first people are so true is that white colonists were takers. They were not givers. And I think that's what you see today. And when I look at the Republican Party, for instance, what I see is not a one novel idea about taking care of people. It's more about tearing things down, being negative, removing things. Or as that one guy from the Republican Party who voted again, that he said, well, people who get welfare and extra money, they're just spending it on drugs and having fun. And that perception is what drives white men, particularly in this country, to view people of color. It was suspect, lazy, in other words, not intelligent. And I think that same viewpoint was the same how this country started and is still going on today in very large sectors of this country. And so when I think about what early in my life touched me, it was being poor. As my mother said to my father before he became a multimillionaire, we were poor up to the age of 12, and then he became a multimillionaire. My mother looked at him and then said to us quietly and with a whisper, she said, we were much richer when we were poor. And I think that I carry that today, that same way I move in the world.
A lot of these examples, to me, I see almost like a thread of left brain, right brain duality. It's a little bit cliche to say these days, but there's a way of seeing the world as interrelated, as complex and dynamic, as more emotional, as seeing the other person as a person.
Exactly.
And there's a way of categorizing and defining and being overly logical. And when I watched The Color of Fear, that was to me what was so front and center is that one of the participants, I think his name is David, is this white guy, David, he's so left brain. He's so
Yeah, exactly.
trying to make everything make sense and not connecting at all with what anybody's saying.
And then making sense is through his own lens. In other words,
Mm.
if it doesn't make sense, then it can't be real. It was very funny how that one line, or that watching him that day, how profound it was in my last film, in which a white woman student, because that's about young people sharing the state of diversity in our colleges. And the young white student says this, and she looks at the Muslim and other student and says, I be really honest, I have a really hard time when I see Muslim folks and all I can see is their eyes when the hijab is covering all of them. And I said, so what I'd like you to take a good look at is the person standing all in front of you, not just her eyes. And the reason why you can't relate with her is because all you could see the eyes, and that's all you could relate to, but not of all of who she is that's sitting in front of you. And she goes, oh my God, you're right. I'm trying to have her fit into my world, whereas I'm not wanting to see her world, to be curious, to listen to the words she's saying. No, she's not just her eyes. She's talking, she's relating, she's moving, and not even interested in the hijab that she's wearing or the history of being a Muslim or Islam or anything like this. Kind of remind me of that film, Hawaii, in which the Christian guy in the book demands that they no longer have so many wives and that they're gods that they honor, et cetera. He goes, prove to me that your God is powerful. Do something right now to show the power of your God. Right. Come on. And then what I thought was interesting about it is that yet if I were to ask him as a Christian man, where prove your God is existing, or is it simply on faith that you believe that he exists? But that same litmus test that we put out to the rest of the world, we don't hold for ourselves. And, what you're talking about to me, when I think about left and right brain, what I tell people is, I don't think that's how we were born. I remember once walking on a trail, and a little boy was just singing and very touching and very emotional. And the mother looked at him and said, stop being a little girl, be a man. So that's how it gets reinforced to not be emotional. Yeah. So that we as men weren't born being just simply factual or scientific or unemotional, but that we were told in a negative way, be a man, that's girly. Or Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California, said, don't be a girly boy. Same thing that we have about the stereotype we have about gays, being effeminate and all this thing to drive that whole part out. I think that's why we also have difficult issues with trans people, that they should be manly if they're a man. They can't have a neutral gender neutrality. And so I think sexuality is all part of that. And so I don't believe that. I was part of the men's movement. And what I said is that men are emotional. It's not just a feminist issue or a feminine characteristic, but that men were born with that too. And it just wasn't reinforced. And so that's why we see it in business and things like this. So when I worked with business, what I discovered was when I came in emotional, when I told emotional stories, for instance, when I have them start off with just, they pair up in the beginning and they go, so how are you doing today? No, how are you really doing? And then they start really crying and talking and they're going, this is amazing. In less than 5 minutes, we're crying with each other because of the pandemic, because of what's going on, whatever that might be. And then the next question is, I would like you to share someone in your life who deeply affected, very much like your question in a way, that deeply affected who you became. And people would be sharing stories and crying about that too. In other words, everything was personal. And I think that what you're really talking about is emotional intelligence. But what I also call it is relationships, relational relationships and connections with each other. We don't know how to develop that. For instance, somebody was saying to me, Mun Wah, I've only been in your workshop for less than 2 hours. I feel so close to everybody. And I said, the truth of it really is, in every single organization, in every single school, you could create community within seconds. And he said, well, how do you do that? I said, you could have everybody look around the room, stand up, and pair up with somebody and get to know them. You could have every single child, every single day, and every person in your corporation, every day, choose to have lunch with somebody in their department who's different, that they've never met before, and have lunch with them, get to know them. Because the truth of it is, you all go to lunch with the people who look like you, who you can connect to, who are similar to you. So you really don't come out of your comfort zone. Because the truth of it is, we define diversity as honoring differences. I think we're very good at honoring differences. We're not very good at practicing it. We're much better at celebration. We know more about holidays than we do about people themselves. So that personal experience is still lacking in the year 2021, even today. And so for me, that's what I think is missing. And so for me, it's not just the left and right brain. We should have started out this way, having both operating, but not separate from each other, but enhancing and reinforcing and embellishing each side, because both need to be better. I tell people it's good to have both. In fact, it's very useful, but it's rare that you get somebody who has both, who's able to utilize both.
So I want to go back to your transition from being a teacher into this world of diversity. And unfortunately, it has to do with a very painful story, but I think it's really illustrative of how deep your involvement is.
Yeah, it really was a profound moment, because it was also very sad too. Someone once said there are two major moments in our lives: the day we're born and the day we find out why. And I was born to be a teacher. And so in 1985 is when my mother was murdered. And what had happened was, I was on a trip with a good friend, and I was to come back on Sunday to have dinner with my mom at my aunt's house. And my girlfriend said, "Why don't we just stay one more day?" And I said, "Oh, okay." And I did. And then when I got home on Monday morning, my sister said, "God, Mom really missed you at the dinner." I said, "Don't worry, I'm going to see her tomorrow. I'm going to take a day off." And I was all set to take the day off on that Tuesday. And then what ended up is I had to go a mandatory special ed meeting. And it happened to be that was the day my mom was murdered. And I was devastated. And I had done grief work because I was also training to be a counselor at that time too, but nothing prepared me. And it was in a robbery. And my mother was shot 5 times in the head, which is really horrendous. And then how sadly, they also had an open casket and didn't even look like my mom. And it was so sudden. But there were profound moments that I still remember from it. And one was my father in the kitchen crying, just sobbing. And he said, "Didn't I tell you that Black people kill and murder and rape?" And I remember thinking, wow. And we were never allowed to have a Black person come to our home. And so another profound thing that happened was that day we talked about my mom's murder, but more factually. That's how my family operated. And we never talked about it again. I was the only one who talked to the public about it. And no one in my family has ever brought up my mom's death ever again.
Wow.
And for 3 years, I absolutely was traumatized. There's no way around it. I don't remember a thing, to be honest with you. At one of the years that I was teaching, someone came in and said, "Mun Wah, do you notice you have nothing up on the walls of your classroom?" I didn't even see that. I think I was operating very robotically, but I was no longer present. So I went into therapy and went into a men's group. And I realized I was really afraid of really powerful men because my father was very verbally and physically abusive. And so most of my friends were women. And so what ended up was my therapist was a male, and he did men's groups, and he invited me to come. And I got to meet other men and talk about my mom's death, as well as my fear of big, powerful men. And it was there that I slowly came out and enjoyed the company of being with men. And then later on, I realized that the entire men's movement was primarily white men. And one day I got really angry at somebody, and someone said, "Oh, come on." And I said, "What's wrong?" He goes, "I don't even get a sense that you're angry." And I said, "This is really angry for an Asian man." I said, "Oh, I see. What you want me to do is get angry like a white man would." And then I realized that I could only go so far in these groups. And so I started my own Asian men's group. And then it got around the therapeutic community that I had started an Asian men's group dealing with anger, racism, and leadership. And then the American Psychological Association honored me for the work I did. And what ended up was they said, "We wish you had filmed your group." And so I said, why don't we film you? And I had never been into film school or anything. And just hired people, and they filmed me. I was in the group and just talking about what's it like to be Asian. And then it won honorable mention at the San Francisco International Film Festival. And then at the end of the film, I remembered I asked all the Asian men, if you had a white audience, what would you say to them? And they were crying. And I said, why are you crying? And they said they'd never been asked this question. And then the other point was, what good would it do? And I thought, wow. And oftentimes when I did my Asian men's group, where they felt so empowered, they said, well, it's great here, but the things you teach us, the things that you empower us about would not be useful, or even the white world would never be receptive to. And so as a Scorpio, I was very challenged. I thought, I do think these would work. So what ended up is I decided to do one more film, instead of just Asian men, to have men of all different ethnicities, which was The Color of Fear. And I came up with the title because I felt like we're still afraid of color in this country, even though we don't want to admit it. And so I did this film, and of course, then it just took off overnight. And Oprah Winfrey, of course, heard about the film and everything like this. But many things led to something else. And obviously, The Color of Fear then led it, millions of people around the world got to see it. And then overnight, I was thrust into the public eye. And then, of course, it won the best documentary in the United States here in Oakland. What I was unprepared for was these huge audiences to work with them. And I didn't know if the work I did in small groups would work in front of thousands of people. And they actually did. And apparently I didn't realize how unique I was in this field, because it was primarily emotional workshops that I did. And one thing that people didn't know, that when I showed the film, it wasn't to talk about the film. And people thought, why aren't we going to be talking about the film? And I said, no, I want to talk about what it brings up for you when you watch this film. And so it became an incredible dialogue for people of color and for whites to look at, who are you in this film? And so it wasn't about critiquing the film, but rather about white privilege and for also about racism. And then one day I was in Sacramento, California, in front of 500 people, and telling the story of how I came to my mom's death and everything. And then a woman stood up crying, and she yelled out, oh my God, it was my son who murdered your mother. And I got to meet her. We cried and everything. And then from that moment on, I wanted to know more about her son. And it was strangely, I don't know how it happened, I lost her phone number and email. And so I was stuck with having to look up his relatives. And then finally, I kept calling each one. And finally, I just said, well, I'm a friend of him. And then finally, this woman said to me, tell me why you want to find him. And I said, I finally told her the truth. And she said, then we have met. I said, no, we haven't. I don't even know you. She goes, oh, yes, you have. You see, what you don't know is that we as his relatives rented your father's home. Your father couldn't sell it because he had to disclose that people got murdered in it. And so no one wanted to buy it. So he rented it to us. Wow. In fact, you come once a year to put flowers on the deck. And I went, oh my God, that's you. And then she shared with me, but there's more to your story. She said, so why do you want to know all about him? I said, I want to know why he killed my mom. I wanted to know if she said anything. And I know it sounds kind of morbid, but I wanted to know if she said anything at the end. And she said, it's funny you said that, because a cousin of ours shot another one of our cousins, and I went to his trial and I never found out. I don't know if will find out. And I thought a lot about that. And unfortunately, he died before I got a chance to meet him, which I really wanted to. But during that time, I became a counselor and therapist and worked with men who were violent and did men's group. Then came to work with Asian men's groups and then multicultural men's groups. And then eventually I got thrust in the public to do all this work. And I came across Thich Nhat Hanh, who did mindfulness work. And so I started approaching everything from a mindful approach, very spiritually. And also, for the first time, showing how therapy and business and government and social agencies could put mindfulness into a practical sense instead of just a conceptual, spiritual realm, but how to use it practically in all these different fields. Hence, that's how we became a very unique company. And so I kept trying all these different techniques out in every one of those different sectors on how to de-escalate from conflicts, how to communicate, how to create community, what to do when a discriminatory incident occurs, but very practical skill sets. And it became very popular. And so I have all these people certified now doing it. So it led me to a whole nother. I once told people that I still miss teaching, but someone says, you still are, except you're just on a larger scale. But there's never been quite like it because I had kids for 3 years, whereas I do these 3-hour workshops and I don't see these people ever again. And I often tell people when I'm working with adults, even if it's 1,000 to 14,000 people, which is my largest audience, I said, you're slow motion compared to kids. I said, if you could work with kids, 30 kids at a time, and you guys look slow motion. You're much more easier to work with. Though children are harder because they tell the truth very quickly. Adults take at least 5 minutes to finally tell you what they're really thinking. So you got all that time to deal with it. But I think I said, I wish we could all still be more like children because I think we pretend and endure and hide much more elaborately than the gift that we had when we were children to be more direct.
Yeah. That's fascinating. There's so much to unpack there. And there's so many strands that I want to chase. I will start with, I have been very interested in Buddhism. I've been practicing for about 10 years. I wrote my master's thesis on Buddhist philosophy. I'm very interested. And I thought that I'd be more ready for losing someone. I thought that I was more in touch with. And then a few weeks ago, I did lose a very close friend. And in a surprising way, and I wasn't I wasn't ready at all. Or that's not fair to say. I think I had more tools than maybe I would have had otherwise, but it's not the same to understand intellectually the impermanence of life. It's not the same as losing someone you like or someone you love.
I'd like to add something onto that just before you go on for a moment, if you don't mind. Is that I remember those 3 years I was grieving, really traumatized. I remember something that my sister said to me. I said, I just can't seem to move on. And I feel like I'm supposed to. I look out the window and people are walking around and life is still going on. And I feel it's unjust because it's so painful. And she said, one thing I want to assure you of is that it's not going to go away. And she said, you're going to live with this for the rest of your life. And it'll be walking next to you all the time. And I got better. It was like this relief. And I remember once one of my best friends who died of a heart attack, very early, 40-something years old. We went to we had a big old thing out in the Redwoods. And he was a very famous fellow in the Bay Area. And he did diversity work. And Harrison Sims was his name. And everybody's going around sharing this moment to celebrate his life and talking about how he affected them and then their memory of him. And then his brother came next. What he said has never left me. He said, no, this is the worst day of my life. I lost my best friend. I'll never be the same again. No, this is the worst day of my life. And I think what he did for everyone was he put a reality to it. That I think sometimes we want to go to the celebratory level or place so that we could postpone the grief. And I think that's what I appreciated. Perhaps when I talked, it helped you too, was that because when a person dies, it's almost like years or months later, it feels inappropriate to bring it up because everybody looks like they're happy. And I think it's a little like somebody said, we don't like to talk about death because it brings up our own, but that we need to. I think something Woody Allen said that I'm not afraid of death, just dying. And I thought what he really meant by that was just the very act of talking about it, of what it means. And I think that that's part of the healing process. I remember when my mom died, I called her up and I just kept ringing. And then I tell people, and it's Thanksgiving and it's Christmas. And I miss this, the hardest moment of my time is I will not see her. I won't be able to watch her from across the room. And I cry about it. And I so appreciate when people say, I know this is the time you lost your mom. Think of her. It means a lot to me because it gives me permission to cry, to say, yeah, I really miss her. When I'm here watching you with your family or with your mom and dad, I miss it because both my parents are gone now. And you can't take enough classes.
Right.
You can't read enough books. It just hurts here. It's no more different than a breakup or a divorce or what love does to you
Right.
or the loss of love, is that it hurts. It just plain hurts. There's nothing that could save you from that. As someone once said, it's a journey you have to take by yourself. Nobody can take it for you or change it or fix it for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's the thing I realized even as I first found out was, oh, this is never going away. This is a new state of being from now until I die. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can relate to that. And in your case, it also deeply affected your career and your orientation in your career, and you're going deeper and deeper into this area of diversity. And I don't know if you refer to this as social justice, but it's part of what it is. Uh,
Oh, yeah, exactly. But I just want to add a little something to what you said, is that one of the other profound changes was that people say to me, you get so quick into the intimacy, the authenticity, the feeling. You don't let anything go by. You're just right there. And I said, maybe because I missed saying goodbye to my mom by one day. And I said, I took it for granted that she'd be there. So when I'm working with you here, I have one chance with you. Am I going to waste it by all superficial conversation, or will I be real with you? And I said, and if I don't work with you, then my son will have to deal with you, or someone else who, when you're racist or sexist or homophobic, they'll have to deal with you.
Mm.
And so my work is every person counts, or as the Buddhists say, every day a lifetime. And I said, that's what my mom's death did to me. I don't know if I'll be gone. I mean, think about all these people every day, a shooting,
no.
every day a plane crash, every day someone gets murdered, something happens, dies of the virus. No one plans on getting the virus. Our planning today will be your last day. And so I said, we postpone all of this, thinking that we have more time. And so I just said, it has made it very precious for me. And along with that is that it has also put my heart right front and center, not waiting for me to get to know you. One man said to me, it takes me a long time to get to know somebody before I open up or search. I said, that could be forever. Because if I find that you're not very real and not very personal, then I won't want to continue the relationship with you. So you may think that you'll just wait around your time for that to happen. But for me, when I just see you and I see you as being detached or impersonal, then that's it with me. Then I'll feel like, okay, then maybe you don't want to get close. And so I'll go to someone else. And so he looked at me, but wow, I had not thought about that. And I think that's because we think we're immortal in some ways. I'm 75 now. I was October, I was 75. And I realized that I've lived every day. I've lived many professions, a teacher, a poet, storyteller, a therapist, and now a filmmaker, and now a trainer more, and still doing a lot of the workshops. But I'm very proud of what I've left behind. And it's been of service. I think that I did not expect that. I always knew as a teacher, I was giving, but I never thought I could give in such a large scale. And that has been the greatest surprise of my life. And Oprah Winfrey was not the highlight of my life. People keep thinking, well, it must be because I was on her show. I said, no. I said, well, the highlight of my life was the last workshop I just did, where everybody was so moved and touched. And I said, isn't that wonderful? You don't have to refer back to something 20 years ago or one moment you think was fame. I said, this is it. It's what moved you, I saw that look in your eye that you understood, even right now with you. It's wonderful. I feel like I met a new friend. It's been very easy between the two of us. And I'd like it to continue because I just feel this connection. How was I to know the day I walked in here today that it was very natural for you? And it's not something that you can make up. It's just something you feel when you meet somebody. And so I think that's valuable. How lucky, how fortunate for the two of us.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So I want to talk about these workshops because we work in a similar medium of facilitation and workshops. So going back to in the movie with the character of David, and so there's people of different races, and they're talking, and I think his name is David, the resistant
The white guy is David,
yeah,
and Victor is the black
Victor,
man.
exactly, and
the Latino and Asian guy there
and
too.
he just tries to rationalize and shut down every time someone's trying to tell him about some experience, that there's a process of intellectualizing and rejecting and then criticizing the other, and
Right.
and then there's this magical moment where you just ask him, okay, what's preventing you from
What's keeping you from believing
Right.
what Victor is sharing?
right
I remember the American Psychological Association honored me for that intervention, that classical intervention. They asked me where I got it from.
yeah.
I said I had never used it before and I haven't used it since.
Mm.
And they said, so where'd you get it from? There was also an intuitive side of me too, which picked up is I really wondered what's keeping David from believing Victor's story.
Yeah.
And I started, and it has a lot to do with understanding my whole life of why people are in denial. And there's Pema Trojan, who is a Buddhist writer.
Mm.
And she wrote that fear is a natural reaction to moving closer to the truth. And if you ever see that film, My Fair Lady, it's about her. She is very poor, and he trains her to have an accent that is very upper class. Okay. However, the consequence of her now becoming upper class and having that accent is that she can never go back. And I thought about it's a little bit like Slumdog Millionaire, where he starts to think about all these things that he connects to help him where he is right now. And so I thought to myself, if David accepted that what Victor and all the men of color was talking about, then he would have to face that somebody lied to him, that the world in which he believed was how it operated was not so. It would be devastating. Now, people, when you think about it psychologically and therapeutically, it's no more different than a family having to look at incest, violence, all that. So the family denies it to keep the family unit together. We deny that Biden, won the election because we're invested in this. In Jamestown, where they had all those people committing suicide, then accept. In other words, it was too strong to hear the truth. And so that's why I said to him, what keeps you from believing him? And I believe that was the reason why. Which kept me and from the group going into is that he doesn't care. I think he cared, but there was something else that was going on. He cared a lot about his world. So he was coming from that perspective. So if you come from the empathetic side, it's a little bit like how I approach people who are climate deniers. I said, okay, so I want to hear you that you don't believe it's happening. But what I'd like to propose to you, I said, you have grandchildren? He goes, yes. And I said, what if you're wrong? What would that mean to your grandchildren? And they stopped for a moment. It's from my compassion. Not I'm blaming them, but what if you were wrong? And I think that's what I was sharing with David. And then that's how Victor moves in to that one part. So part of what my workshops are about, and it's in the mindfulness approach. And actually, there are many approaches that I teach. For instance, the ones that I teach folks now is, so it might be, so David, what I heard you say is that you can't believe these could be happening to Victor and things like this. So David, we're going to get to those. But before we do, did you notice Victor's reaction when you were sharing? So he might go, yeah, what did you see? Well, he was going like this. He wasn't connecting me. So what I'd like you to do, ask Victor, what happened? And then I might go to Victor and I'll say to Victor, so Victor, what happened? When he said this, what angered you about what David said? What hurt you about what he said? What's familiar about what David said? And what do you wish David could have said differently that would have opened you up? So then that begins a dialogue between the two. Now, what's revolutionary about that one part is for the very first time, the person who is victimized or confronted gets to share their anger, their hurt, the history, and what they wish they could have had differently. Rather than simply sitting there, as I was taught, to educate David as a therapist or as a facilitator. The other one that I could have also done with David quicker too was, David, did you notice the reaction in the room? So it could be someone else sharing that with him. Another one is, before we get to that, David, if you wanted to find out why Victor said what he did, what would be a good question to ask him? So we can get that too. So all of that is about that, re-engaging them within seconds in a very conflictual, polarizing scenario. Now, people say to me, that's amazing, but can it really work? And I said, well, it really worked there. But I'll give you a very up-to-date one. What I did was I had, you won't believe this is a profound story, because the day that Trump got elected, I was on the road, 4 audiences, 400 each, all around the country. And the very first one I had was to show the film and then have a discussion. And then the sponsor came up and said, you can't do it. The room is so polarized and upset by the election of Trump and Clinton that we've got to deal with it. So I'm in the room, and this Black woman and this white guy are yelling at each other. And so what I did was I simply paired everybody up. And then the question was simply this: each of you will get 5 minutes, but you'll go through 5 steps that I'll take you through as a speaker. Then you'll switch, and the other person will get to talk for 5 minutes, and then you'll go through all these steps. And the question was this: as a, whatever your ethnicity, gender, et cetera is, what was good and what was hard about this election for you? Now, the other person had to hear you. And they had to, when it came, that person finished, then they got 5 minutes to ask you, to keep you talking, not attacking you, not denying you, or whatever that is, or blaming you, but just simply being more curious. I give them a whole set of questions, and the questions are these. So what I heard you say was that as a Black woman, it was devastated, And then the second question is, tell me more about that, which is also the same ones about, tell me what angered you, what hurt you about the election, what was familiar, et cetera. And then what did you really need during this time? And then at the end, you are to tell the person, you're the speaker, you tell the listener what they did well and what they could improve on. So in other words, if they only asked questions that were factual, if they felt disconnected, you could tell them, and what they did well. Then at the last question for the listener is, tell the speaker what moved or touched you about what they shared. In other words, not going, well, let me tell you the real truth, or solve it, or I didn't like it. You had to tell them what moved or touched you about what they shared. Then they switched. Now, this all took a total of 24 minutes for both to speak. Wow. At the end of it, the group wanted to know, how are these two doing? So I had them stand up. And this is what the white said to the Black woman: I had no idea what this election meant to you. I just had no idea. And the Black woman looked at him and said, I never thought that somebody, a white man, would even be interested, who voted for Trump, or cared how I felt. And they hugged each other, and he said, we have so much more to talk about, don't we? And that was all in a span of 24 minutes. And it was happening all around the room. And what I tell people, I said, is that I think that denial, attacking, blaming, not taking responsibility, not wanting to give people I want to know what they need or want, has become what looks like normal communication, rather than curiosity, self-reflection, taking responsibility, and the willingness to change, is what healthy communication looks like. And so we've forgotten that. And so we have to be reminded. I think we all have the capacity to hear each other's story. And we really need it really badly at this time, because I think I've never seen us so publicly polarized in my whole life. And I think that it's very true that we could have had civil war. Had Pence not said, no, I'm not going to invalidate the election, I believe very strongly, and had the military had said to Trump, no, we are not going to support you to invalidate the election, we will not militarily wise, that we could have changed in this country. And I still would think we're on the brink of that still. And I'm hoping for people to come through, but that's why these workshops are so important, to talk to each other rather than pick up guns. Rather than to hurt each other or ourselves. And it's rapidly getting to a place where we're thinking that physical violence is the only way to prove that you're right, and it's through power. And so I think it's more important than ever. And that's what, to me, what social action looks like. And I strongly believe that institutional change is very difficult. I think that social change and relational change are much faster to happen. I think that it will take white people, white males particularly, to change. As I think somebody once said, that whites can't live without people of color, and people of color can't live without whites. We have to do it together. Women can't do it without men, and men can't do it without women. And even though we'd like to think we can. And when you think about climate change, it's like somebody said is, you can celebrate at the top of the ship, you're in first class, but if there's a hole in the ship, we're all going down.
Right. Yeah. So I want to dive into more head on into the problem of racism. And I think what I learned in the past 5 to 10 years that I didn't know is that racism is it's a lot less about the old school KKK, very explicit sort of racism, and it's a much more about how you treat another person that doesn't look like you. How do you see them? How do you react to them? What message you're sending with your eyes and voice when you're talking to them? How curious are you, right? And so in the end, it sometimes feel like when we're talking about racism, what we're really talking about is, except for the clear and very dangerous and very kind of extreme cases, we're really talking about being a good neighbor and an empathetic person.
Well, actually, I think it's a little. Well, it's a little bit of like, if I were to go to Israel, I would say that it's not about you and the Palestinians, it's just about respecting people. Then the deep historical hurts and wounds are still there, and then religiously. And then it's a little bit like an Israeli saying, we really respect you, that you want to have your own state, but we keep taking over more and more territory. So then from the outside, I'm looking at that, okay? And so I think that when I think about racism, to be really honest with you, is that I remember how many corporations have asked me to come work with them. And we like, for instance, major tech companies said we like to talk about empathy. Our friend of mine said today is, I want us to talk about respect for each other. And another one said that I'd like to talk about our togetherness and our oneness. And what I said was simply this. I remember there was this wonderful place called Harbor Hot Springs, and so they had a celebration for the New Year and all this. And they said, I'd like to honor the oneness in all of us, and as we're all gathered here together and on this earth. And then I just simply, I don't know why I said this. I just said, I'll be really honest with you, is I have not shared or even looked or got to know one single person in this room. I don't feel connected. In fact, there's been no attempt for us to talk to each other. And we're holding hands in a circle, but this is the first time I've even touched this person. And then you're talking about this oneness. I remember John Hope Franklin, who did the National Conversation on Race, and I was in Atlanta there, and Roberto Almanzan, who's in the film, he and I were there. And he says, today, as we're all here, sitting here together, and da-da-da. And I said, first of all, John, let's take a good look at this room. White people are all sitting separately, at least one pew away from a person of color. But we are not sitting next to each other, nor have we looked at each other, nor have we introduced ourselves to each other. And you're a Black man sitting in the front, and we're talking to you, and you're talking to us, but we're not talking to each other. And Dr. Franklin, maybe I should say something on a much larger context, is that in the National Conversation on Race, we all talk to a panel, hundreds and thousands of people in a room, and not one talk to each other. And where is this national dialogue on race? It was only to a panel. It was not to each other. And we are still not doing that as we're sitting in this room. And so for me, is when I said to that person, when they said, a reporter said, I'd like you to talk about inclusion. And I said, no. He goes, you're one of the foremost authorities on diversity. And I said, no, but I want you to ask me why. And so he said, okay, why? And I said, not unless you're willing to talk about exclusion. When you want to talk about empathy, I would like you to talk about hatred and fear and the lack of empathy. When you want to talk about respect, I want you to talk about disrespect, insulting somebody. And I said, just because you don't want to talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt me and my children and my generations that has happened to us. Just because you want the American first people to trust you and Blacks to trust police and government doesn't go away all the injustices that are going on today that are still happening.
Right.
Do I not want to talk about the KKK? Maybe we should look at it more closely. How come you don't hear more about the KKK? Where did they go? Is it something that was only in the 50s? Or maybe as a Black woman said something that I thought was profound. Don't you know where the KK went? They joined the police force. And so I thought, are you kidding? And at that time I was working with the government. And guess what? For 4.5 years, I worked for the United States government, the Pentagon, doing workshops. And guess what one of them said? We decided one day to film from one of our drones to film a KKK rally. And guess who they discovered went there? About 100 military men were there. And just recently, a police officer wanted to share his tattoos, KKK, right on his chest.
Yeah.
And for the very first time, there were comments that people said that they heard were things like this: "Don't even look at me," from cops. "Don't even stand there. No, I'm not going to show you my badge." And would hit them. People had never heard things like that.
Yeah.
But people in the South remembered they couldn't be on the same sidewalk. They couldn't look at white people. And so in my film, where the student was murdered, Mark Thompson, 4 years later, we filmed the film and he went back to his town in Chico, California. And when he was there, he was walking through the town with his ex-white girlfriend. The KK was spitting on him, throwing him, calling him all sorts of names. 4 hours later, he was burned alive in the trunk of his car. Now, what was profoundly painful about that is that 2 weeks later, when we finally were able to get up there, the police had not even put yellow tape around the area. And it was the second or third incident where a Black man got burned in a car. And the police only interviewed the family to see if there was any drug connections, but not to look for any suspects.
Yeah.
And I said, "You see what's going on here?" And you know what the Black resident said to me? "You do know the police have joined the KK. The KK has joined the police." And I saw the look on your face when I said that. We have not even thought about, why are the police being so brutal? Is there a possibility that they join?
No.
And by the way, to be a teacher, to be a therapist, to be a police officer, there is one major question that is not on their application. Are you a member of a hate group? And right now, the military is discovering how many are in hate groups.
Yeah.
And so for me, my work, and I think the work is important, is to let people tell their stories about what has happened to them. And the work is for us, for whatever group we're in, whether you're males with women, et cetera, is to go through the process to tell them how moved we are when we hear it, to reflect back to them. Tell me more. What angered you? What hurt? To hear the story and be validated. I think that people have stopped telling their stories because they've been invalidated. They paid a price. They got demoted. They got labeled. And then we don't ask those people, what do you need or want? We make it up. When I was working for a major, the top 3 company in the world, and a Black woman in that workshop talked about how hard it was. She didn't care whether she was vice president. In one of the major departments, made 6 figures and said, "I'm leaving. I don't see anybody who looks like me. I feel so isolated. I feel so alone. I see the way how you put down people of color." And then another executive comes up to me after, "That was the best workshop we ever have. But I have a request. Can we skip all the personal stories next time?" Another number 2 company in the world did an incredible survey of all their employees. Okay, then they read out in front of all the department heads, okay? And I was in that room. They asked me to come in as a consultant. And these people talked about how they were unsupported, except for the white men, of course. Gays, blacks, Latinos, Asians didn't feel supported. So then, guess what? Somebody was suing the company, and a lot of the major organizers for the event had to leave the room to deal with it immediately. And they said, would you take over, Mun Wah? And so this is what I did. Everybody take out a piece of paper, and I'd like you to write down what you think of the assessment. And you could write it down anonymously. 90-something% of people who wrote in comments was, these were bullshit. It was skewed. It was biased. They did not believe it occurred. Now, I kept these to myself. Then I had, that time we got to lunchtime, I met with all the organizers, and I simply said this, well, so what do you think? What do you think about the managers, how they took in the assessment? They, oh, it was wonderful. I said, how did you know that? You could see, Mun Wah, the look on their faces. Nobody rejected it. People were quiet. You could see that they were really there. They're with us. They're all on our diversity objectives. And then I shared with them the results of the assessment that I wrote. The room was dead quiet. Dead quiet. And then guess what happened the next day? They let go of my services. All over this country, it's still going on in every single agency. And why they call me in is so that they could talk about it, and so they could get to a place where they could find out what's going on, what's needed, et cetera. That all of these celebrations of unity and of oneness didn't mean anything to anybody because it still kept going on.
Yeah.
And the things, if you could hear, are just horrendous. You know, we already got one person of color. Why would we want more? All of these things that are still alive and going on. And so that's the work. And I don't think people will fall apart if they talk about what's not working. Because I think that it's like I shared with Kaiser Hospital. I said, when your patients come in, do you do this? I could see you got 2 healthy eyes. You got 2 healthy ears. You look really great to me. No, they ask you, where does it hurt? How long has it been going on? Is it generational? How does it affect you emotionally, physically? How does it affect you in terms of work, your relationships? Are you taking any medications? How does it affect you emotionally, stress-wise? They talk about what's not working. They have to find that out, but we don't do that here. We want it to become a celebratory thing. And that's why, and one man said to me when I was at Major One at Hewlett-Packard, this is what he said, why the hell do we have to have these workshops? Why do we have to keep telling these stories again and again? Why do we have to do that? You know, it's going to go on and on. And guess what? This woman stood up and she said, Michael, this is our first workshop. And the question became where did he learn those phrases from? That differences will divide us. Why do we have to keep talking? We just go on and on. Because those were how we react to when we have to bring it up. And that's why for me, we've still at Diversity 101 in the United States. We've still got a long ways to go.
Yeah.
And by the way, we can't even still talk about what's going on in Israel between Israelis and Palestinians without us getting the same polarization to hear each other.
Yeah.
And by the way, I did work with Israelis and Palestinians in my home. And it was profound because I taught them how to hear each other. And when they were done, they went, wow, I could see why you felt the way you did.
Yeah.
I could see why you don't trust us or my family. And so they came to this place of empathy rather than that was the only world that I saw was from where I was coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these programs, even on the ground here, that are very powerful in the moment. And yet it's hard to not feel cynical because the scale of the problem is so large that, we keep making a difference. I mean, and maybe it's just that it takes a very long time when you do it like 20 people by 20 people to change millions of minds.
Somebody said that to me once. They asked me that same question. Do you think that you're very effective at what work you do? And I said, I lived in the 60s where it was an incredible time. And I lived in Haight-Ashbury. It's on top of that. And then I never saw such a sense of coming together and community and social action and social issues were really right up there. I remember taking a political science class and it was on revolution. And you walked in the class and the teacher said, all right. Then he opened up the blinds and there were cops and kids, explosions everywhere, gunfire. And he goes, see you back in 2 weeks. This is revolution. You're living it. Write a paper on it. And so what I said is that profoundly affected me, all the music, all the drugs, everything. And I said, I was never the same again. And I said, when people take my workshops and they see what's possible, coming together, connection, learning skills, how to listen to each other, dealing with conflict, that they'll never be the same again. I said, you'll never be able to close your eyes to what could be possible and you'll change. So that I estimated close to maybe 700,000 people have taken my workshops. Over 30 million people have seen my films.
Yeah.
Do you imagine what that's like for how they tell another person? They tell another person. Gandhi was the same way. He believed that it'd be a ripple effect. And I am lucky because I think I'm not the only one in the world doing this work like yourself, that there are thousands of more of us, each of us working with a small group to reach more. And you're absolutely right. If it's not about money, it's about because it's your love and because you're doing something good. People will hear about it. People will learn. I will tell people more about this with you just because of my connection with you here. That's how it starts. And I believe that I don't necessarily know if I'll see institutionalized change because I often tell people, you could have institutionalized change. You could have the president of the United States be a black man, just like we just recently had. But what did the Republicans say? We will vote no on everything until the next election. And they did. And so what I said is, it does no good to have institutionalized change if, in fact, people aren't open to it once you get there. So you'll have to come with an open heart. You'll have to come with wanting to learn, to wanting to grow. And that's perhaps what we need to start doing. I said, so you might as well start practicing it now, because even if you got into that position being president of your company, you will still have to deal with each other. There's no way you can avoid it. You don't have that much power. Obama said, I can't do it by myself. He was dead right. He had to work with some people. And even though it was very difficult, and even though it's hard even today, I think that it's something we still have to keep working at. And I don't give up on it. I strongly believe that we're more powerful than we know.
So I want to ask you about your autobiography that's coming soon.
Yeah.
And
wow, huh?
It's a lovely name, River of Jade. And yeah, tell me more about this book, why you chose to write it, and what can we expect?
Well, it's called River of Jade, and people all wanted to know, tell me about yourself. Like where did this come from? And I wanted people to know me before my films. The things that shaped me, the things I loved about Oakland, California, which was once considered one of the most dangerous cities in the country. I lived at a time when there was like 30, 40% of us each in our high schools. So Latinos, Asians, Blacks, et cetera. And a time when white people who were wealthy lived in the flatlands of Oakland before they fled white flight. And what that little life was like for me growing up, seeing that, and then watching the white flight. Suddenly, it was only people of color who were poor left in the flatlands of Oakland. And I often tell people how sad, because you didn't get to see what it was like for us to really be with each other and hang out and play with each other. And so it was very rich for me to see, but also I was not spared. My father told all these stories about racism that occurred to him in his restaurant. And by the way, in my story, I talk about that one day I saw my father spit in a people of color food and put pepper in it so they wouldn't come again. And you can imagine the shame I had when I saw my father do that. And later on, my father shared that white people said to my father, I'm so glad that your restaurant doesn't have those people here. And another thing is, why can't Black people be like Asian people? You're so wonderful, trustworthy, respectful, family-oriented. And so, like growing up, I wanted to share how those stories affected my father. And so how did my father work it out? Is that Black people figured, and by the way, they had to wait for an hour sometimes to get a seat. So they decided to do takeout. That was the truce. They come in, they go out. They don't get to stay. And if they did, that's what my father would do to their food so they wouldn't eat again. And I think that Oakland became very divided. White people in the high and rich areas, like every place in America. But what it also taught me was that it's important to remember, as my father got wealthy, to remember what happened to him as a Chinese man. Because the woman, he wanted to expand his restaurant, and the woman said, "I won't sell to a chink." And so even as my father got successful, and she said, "I want to sell my home to you," he said, "No, I'm never going to buy it from you." He was never going to do that. He said, the way he got treated. Then my father shared something with me. He said, "Did you know when you were 10 years old, 1956, that Chinese people could not go to bathroom in a white restaurant? They could not buy property, like Black people could not buy property. Asian people could buy it only in Chinatown." So how did Chinatown start? That's how it started. You could only get a job, go to bathroom there. How did Japan start? That's how people forgot that history. It didn't. Germantown, there's all this racism. That's how they stayed in that area, because they'd get played. These are things that people don't even know about.
Right.
That happened. And so these are stories that were always sitting there that were hidden from me. And I think that it was like the mythology that all people who are oppressed say, maybe if we don't talk about it, it'll go away. But not really. So in my story, I talk about growing up, but also what I saw and what I didn't see. I talked about how certain teachers changed the course of my life, how they cared. And then I also talk about the effect my mom's death had on me. And then my life as a teacher and things I really created new things that people have never done in teaching. And then I talk about what it was like to be an Oprah Winfrey. And then I talk about what's it like traveling this country to the Pentagon, to boardrooms all over this country, right, into the top companies of the world that I actually did work with. And so it really gave an insight perspective of who I became. And also, I think I say with a great deal of sadness is also who I didn't become. And that's what racism and my father taught me. Don't ever expect to be the president of IBM. Don't ever expect to be the president of the United States. You'll never see it in your lifetime. You're really nice and respectful, but you'll never be able to go further because they don't think that you're assertive enough or have, aggressive enough. But they love you when you're quiet, a team player. And be ready because, and I had to discover how Blacks were so angry at Asians because we got moved ahead. And they were often compared to us very unfairly. And so in my story, even in Color of Fear, I talk about these were stories that we were taught to be separated from each other. And so, and it's called River of Jade because Herman Hesse wrote a book called Siddhartha. And he talked about at the end that Siddhartha is the anointed one. They think will be the guru of all. But he ends up just working as a boat, taking people back and forth. And one of his neighbors says to him, his childhood friend says to him, "Why are you just doing this? Just being a ferryman." And he says, "Well, it's all here. It's all in this river. Good and bad are mixed. Good and evil are all mixed." And you learn so much by watching the river. And so I called it the River of Jade. And the reason why I said jade was because my mother said that jade changes color. Most people don't know that the more deeply you live, however tragic or however romantic, it changes the color. And so on the day that my mother was murdered and my sister had gotten her bracelet and in the crevices was her blood. And on the day that I finished The Color of Fear, I was sitting at a cafe and I read about a person who forgave the killer of their mother. And I said, I can never do that. And then I came to the bottom of the article and there was my mother's name. The man who killed my mother had killed 3 other women. And that was the day that I forgave him because I realized if he hadn't killed my mother, I would never have done this film or gone into this work. And then you won't believe this. The day that I forgave him, the blood left the bracelet. It was no longer there. And then just recently it broke. And I feel in many ways that I was meant to do this work. It was perhaps destined that I carry such a tragedy in my heart but it also took me to places that I never dreamed.
Hmm.
And I probably could never have gotten to these places if it wasn't for my film. Our Oprah Winfrey, I don't know if people would have even let a Chinese man get on to talk about these issues, but it has profoundly helped me to help other people and even get on this show today, perhaps too, just to begin that conversation.
Thank you.
You brought up a lot for me today because it's not only my beginning to start, but also to think about that I'm coming to the end of my life. And also what a life it's been. I would never have traded it with anyone. And as I wrote in my book, that there was a life well lived. And one that I never could have planned or figured on, but it was deeply lived. And I deeply meant it. I went for it. I really deeply invested into teaching, being a poet, being a storyteller, being a therapist, and then doing this. I lived it deeply and fully, and as if I had nothing to lose. And maybe I felt that way. And I think that maybe if we did that to each other, and one of my films is called Last Chance for Eden. And the idea was, what if we only had today to tell the truth to each other? What if this is the last chance we have? Well, I remember somebody in one of my men's groups said, I was going to do something like Color of Fear. And I was going to do that film. And then someone yelled at him, why didn't you just do it? And he said, well, I've never been to film school. And I said, well, neither have I. But I just thought if I told the world, I want to do this because it's important. Or as a woman came up to me and said, I want you to do one on the internment. And I looked at her and I said, why? She goes, my parents were interned and they had love letters and I'm Japanese and it's really important to me. And I said, then you should do it. And she gave up her therapy and then went on to become a filmmaker. I said, it'll be the hardest thing you've ever done, but it'll mean so much because you know what it was like.
Yeah.
I would only be a witness to it all. You saw the tears of your parents and what they lost. And I became real about racism because I saw it as real. I lost my mother. And by the way, when I visited a prison recently in Minneapolis, what I said is I told them the story of my mother because they all wanted to meet me because of the Color of Fear. And what I said to them was that my son was put about 4 months in jail for talking back to a police officer who stopped him in daylight for headlights that didn't work. Can you imagine that? And by the way, I was stopped for the same citation when I was 22 too. The only difference was he talked back. And he was put into solitary confinement for 2 months and he went crazy. And so I looked at all of them today and I said, as I'm looking at all of you here, some of you with life sentences, some of you with 30, 40 years, I said, I don't know how you do it. But what I want to say to you is, don't let anybody tell you that you're less than because you made a mistake in your life. And you're going to have to work together so you could stay alive. Don't let them take the humanity out of you. And then they had this huge line. People were coming up and crying and hugging to me. And it was so profound about it that there were some social workers who were very young there. And later on, I had a meeting with them and they said, do you know the people that came up to you have not shown any emotion or said anything in the 10, 15 years they've been here? And yet in minutes, you got them to talk. And we've been told, don't relate to them like this. Don't get no personal. And we realized they lied, Mun Wah, because you did something here that we thought that's how you treat them. Relate to them, be with them. Don't be detached. And we're not going to continue to do that. And so it kept rippling the effect. But I think that my own story is real. This is diversity and discrimination and violence are not separate from. And I care deeply about this country, but what I shared is I wanted to live up to its goals and dreams, not just simply celebrate them. I think that I Have a Dream is still a nightmare for so many people in this country. And we've got to each take responsibility for that.
Thank you so much.
Would you mind if we took a moment before you closed?
Sure.
Okay. Because there's something I had really wanted to read to you because it was something that I wrote during the George Floyd thing and about speaking up. And it was just a small paragraph that I wrote, but it's also in my new book too. But it's like this about speaking up. I believe that we are all tested, maybe not in the way we planned or wanted. But when the time comes, we will either act with courage and goodness or with fear and silence. For each of us deep down knows what is right and what is wrong. And it is that moment when we are tested that our history is written, to be remembered, or to be looked back on with regret. It is a choice that we each must make for ourselves and for those not yet born. For each decision we make in life affects everything and everyone from that moment on. Each time we do not speak up, someone always pays a price for our silence. And that same price is also exacted on who we become and who we do not. So you see, it is where the road ends that our path begins.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.